countries bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
All right, Push. Mr. Beamer here, another video. We're into chapter 40, only a few more chapters. Fire up. We're going to talk about the 1950s. This is the Eisenhower era, and it's the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. Really, after World War II, we really divide up history into two, domestic policy and foreign policy. The foreign policy was really all about the Cold War and stopping the spread of communism. Domestic policy in America, we had a lot of big issues. The two biggest issues are, one is the economy. That's always a major issue in a push. And the second one is civil rights. The civil rights movement begins in the 50s and continues into the 1960s, and that ties into our song. Again, a lot of you skipped this first slide, but go back and listen to this song. It's from Billie Holiday. She sung the song in the late 30s into the 1940s, and it's called Strange Fruit, a very sad, sad song. And really the point of it is to show how something needs to be done to end inequalities and injustice, especially towards African Americans. All right, so we begin chapter 4. We talk about a little bit of politics. We're going to talk about Dwight David Eisenhower, perhaps the greatest general of World War II. His nickname was Ike. I like Ike, you like Ike. Well, really, everybody likes Ike. That was his campaign slogan. So he runs against the Democrat Adlai Stevenson. Not necessary in a push. So we know that Eisenhower was a war hero. His vice president, I think, is important. For 8 years when he's president, his vice president is anti-communist Richard Nixon. I would definitely know that Nixon was very against communism. Unfortunately for Nixon, he was criticized of some corruption. Oh my goodness, imagine that! Before even becoming vice president in 1953, he was accused of slush funds, of getting money from private donors, of getting illegal contributions. And Nixon saved his political career with the checkers speech. I highlight this. Checkers is not referring to the game. Checkers is the Nixon family dog. Ooh, I just heard Miggy in the background. Basically, Nixon goes on national television and says the only thing he ever received was a dog named Checkers. It's the only bribe. It's not even a bribe he ever received from somebody. And Nixon's like, I am not giving up Checkers because my little dog, Trisha, loves Checkers so much. And so this actually makes Nixon look likable and a family man, and this saves his political career. It showed the importance of television, how that is important in politics. Well, in the election, Nixon easily wins the 1952 election, and he does make good on his campaign promise to end the Korean War. So the Korean War is done by 1953 because Eisenhower brings the troops out. So the result of the Korean War, I would highlight this: Korea remains divided at the 38th parallel. So the United States did not capture all of Korea. So North Korea does remain communist, but we do stop the spread of communism. Communism is contained in Korea. However, 54,000 Americans did die in the Korean War. All right, Ike takes command. That is Eisenhower's nickname, and he was loved by the people. To highlight this, people loved him. He was a war general, likable, calm personality, not as abrupt and abrasive as Truman was. And America needed this after 20 years of depression and war, World War II, and the Korean War. Okay, one of Ike's early issues he had to deal with was a Senator Joseph McCarthy. Okay, highlight this name, a must know. This is one of his biggest domestic issues. Joe McCarthy, this man right here, was a staunch, and that's not even the right word. He was very, very anti-communist. He accused 205 people of being communist in the State. In the State Department. The State Department handles foreign policy. He never proved any of these people as being communist, but he was a big accuser. He spread these rumors, and he ruined the lives of many of these people. And his accusations did help foster the second Red Scare in the early 1950s. People were afraid that anybody could be communist in the country. In 1954, McCarthy goes even further. He accuses communists of being in the army, and you do not mess with the army. And so after he accused communism of being in the army, people realized that this guy is a big joke, and his political career was ruined, and he died 3 years after his accusations of the army. He died one of the most disgraced Americans ever. I'm not a fan. All right, a big part of domestic policy in the 50s and 60s is civil rights. Okay, and so we've got a lot to cover, a lot of very important things to know. A little bit of review. So, blacks in the South faced severe Jim Crow laws. We know this since about the 1890s. Lynchings were very common in the South, especially, which is a terrible time, really from the beginning of American history up until really the 1950s and 60s. But anyway, after the 1890s, segregation, Jim Crow laws were very common between whites and blacks. By the 1950s, a little statistic for you. Only 20% of eligible blacks could vote due to the intimidation, discrimination, and poll taxes in place by Southern whites. So African Americans did slowly start to fight back for rights. The NAACP, make a connection, W.E.B. Du Bois in 1910 helped found that organization. And then CORE was formed during 1943 during World War II, again pushing for legal rights. But again, they did struggle up until the 1950s. And then it happens, 1955, there she is. Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama, is arrested, and this helped spark the beginning of the civil rights movement with the event called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. The boycott of the Montgomery bus system by mostly African Americans, but also white people. They refused to get on the bus, and so for over 1 year, they boycotted the buses. They walked to work, they rode bikes, they carpooled, whatever they could do, but they did not go on the bus system. And it worked. The bus boycott worked. The buses were eventually desegregated by the city of Montgomery. I would also highlight this. Martin Luther King Jr. Really becomes the leader of the bus boycott, and this is the beginning of him becoming the leader of the civil rights in America during the 50s and 60s. And so I would like to highlight that the Montgomery bus boycott begins the civil rights movement during this time period. Highlight that. Fire up for some more civil rights. A lot of important things. Highlight this. 1947. Truman sought to improve blacks, and so he desegregates the military. I would know this. Truman desegregates the military, so now whites and blacks will be fighting together with each other against a common enemy. Also, in that same year, 1947, baseball player, what is his name? Jackie Robinson ends the color barrier in Major League Baseball, and maybe you've seen the movie 42, but in 1947, he becomes the first African American in Major League Baseball. So there are some seeds of civil rights changing in America. Highlight this. Eisenhower, not a big fan of civil rights, did not really do much during his presidency, except in a few cases we'll talk about in a minute. A lot of things to highlight. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, takes over as the head of the Supreme Court, and he surprises and upsets many conservatives because he's more liberal. He's more in favor of ruling for black civil rights, and we'll see that a lot in the 1960s. Oh my goodness, highlight that. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This reversed 1954, one of the worst Supreme Court decisions, Plessy v. Ferguson. Brown v. Board ends separate but equal in America in public schools. So highlight this. Segregation is ended in public schools. However, segregation does occur in public facilities and restrooms and so on. But in public schools, segregation is supposed to be done. However, many deep southern states, such as Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, they tried to delay integration as much as possible. They signed, I highlight this, the Declaration of Constitutional Principles in the 1950s. This basically said that we are not going to integrate or desegregate. We're going to keep whites and blacks separate. By 1964, this is just an interesting fact, fewer than 2% of eligible black students actually sat in the same classes as whites. So 10 years after Brown, integration was occurring at a very, very slow pace. Oh my goodness, lots of information, a lot of important stuff, a lot of stuff that maybe you remember from 10th grade history. So let's talk about the Little Rock Nine, and here is the background of that. And basically 9 black students tried to integrate the all-white Little Rock Central High School. I'll put up some pictures here in a second, but a few weeks later, they were not allowed. Okay, the governor did not allow them to do that, and so they could not go. A few weeks later, President Eisenhower, in one of the few moves that he makes to try to help civil rights, he does send the United States National Guard down to Little Rock, and these National Guard soldiers from all around the country escort the 9 Little Rock students to class for the next year. Their National Guard with them in school. So this shows, I think it's important, that the federal government was willing to enforce integration, and so Eisenhower did do that. Also, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was passed. This is not as important as the 64 Civil Rights Act. In APUSH, the must-know is 1964 Civil Rights Act, but be aware that civil rights was improving even in the 1950s. So again, I mentioned this, and I would highlight this. The Little Rock Nine, the Civil Rights Act, showed the federal government is starting to become more involved in civil rights, but is really going to continue into the 60s. JFK is really going to push for even more civil rights, and also Lyndon B. Johnson after JFK. All right, more highlighting. Highlight this. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, created by MLK Jr. in 1957. This year's not extremely important to know, but MLK Jr. creates this leadership conference of Southern black church leaders. And this organization is around, or the civil rights movement, very important, the SCLC. This is what you need to know. And they tried to promote civil rights through nonviolent protests, and MLK Jr. was the head of the SCLC. All right, it's going to be a long video. I apologize, but there's so much important stuff to know. Huge event, 1960. 4 black students launch a sit-in in North Carolina at Greensboro Woolworth store. This is the beginning of the sit-in movement of the 1960s. So we like to say in APUSH, the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 begins the movement, but it really kicks off in the 60s with the sit-in movements, and it begins in North Carolina. And this event marks a more active civil rights movement throughout the 1960s, really ending in 1968. By the end of the week, after the first 4 black students did sit-ins, over 1,000 students launched sit-ins across the South. Sit-ins, people would sit at the segregated black or white lunch counters, or the white lunch counters, and they would have food thrown at. They would get arrested. So these students would get arrested and get mocked, but they did this to prove a point to try to help end segregation. Finally, SNCC, another important group to highlight, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, created in 1960. Key thing is young people. This is an organization of young people going to use nonviolent protests to try to stop segregation and discrimination. And the biggest tool of SNCC was the sit-in. This slide will not be as long, I promise. All right, so Eisenhower, now more domestic policy, more economic stuff. Okay, his biggest thing was to be liberal with the people, try to be helpful to the people. But biggest thing is his economics was going to be conservative. Okay, he's going to limit government spending and hopefully eventually start to lower taxes for people. And so highlight this one. He wanted to get rid of some New Deal programs that he thought were too expensive and unnecessary. And he tries to decrease military spending. He's somewhat successful, but by the end, military spending does increase during Eisenhower's presidency. But that was one of his goals, was to cut spending. All right, Bracero program, a must know. That was created during World War II to bring Mexicans up to help with the farming during the war. And this program was being threatened by a bunch of illegal Mexican immigrants. And so Eisenhower approved of Operation Wetback. Highlight this government program that was going to send these illegal Mexicans back to Mexico in 1954. Operation Wetback. Again, this shows kind of the tension between different racial groups, ethnic groups, especially out west in California. Bracero program, incidentally, was eventually ended in 1964 by bringing Mexican migrant workers to farm on American farms, especially in California. Also, Native Americans. Ike tried to reverse the Indian New Deal, name a president. Indian New Deal, New Deal. FDR, he tried to reverse it and tried to promote forced assimilation back the way it was with the Dawes Act, but that failed, so this was not reversed. And highlight this, a must-know, 1956, the Interstate Highway Act is passed, $27 billion, but he wanted to cut spending. Well, Eisenhower spent a bunch of money, $27 billion. It was a great idea. 42,000 miles of highways, suburbanized America, and allows us to travel all over the country. PCB, Panama City Beach, 2014, to go on spring break because of these highways. So if you're going somewhere during spring break, thank Eisenhower, and it really was a big boom for the economy. Briefer with foreign policy. All right, so a lot of domestic policy. Eisenhower's foreign policy, I highlight this. Massive retaliation. Basically, he wanted to reduce military spending. He's like, you know what? We're not going to go like attack people as much. We're not going to do like we do in Korea. We're going to build these super bomber airplanes that was created by the program called SAC, Strategic Air Command. Build these super bombers that could travel basically halfway around the world. We can drop nukes on China and the Soviets if they don't do what we want. So if they threaten us, if they attack us, we are going to bomb all their cities. It's a little bit scary, but it was cheaper though, so it did save us some money. All right, highlight this guy. After Stalin dies in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev. He's going to be around really for the next 15 years, dealing with Kennedy and LBJ. Khrushchev is the new Soviet leader. Better than Stalin. He was better than Stalin, but better relations never really did develop. He was still kind of a hothead. There was a revolt in Hungary. Hungary was controlled by the Soviets because they were east of the Iron Curtain. Hungary's like, hey, America will help us. We did not. We never got involved. Ike was not willing to use nuclear weapons to help a smaller revolution in Eastern Europe. Lastly, highlight the military-industrial complex. And this is where I actually give Eisenhower a little bit of credit. He warns America in his final farewell speech. He warns them of this idea that we need to limit our military, because if we keep building up nuclear weapons with the arms race, eventually this is going to cause World War III and the end of the world as we know it. But I feel fine. So military-industrial complex, he warns about spending so much money on the military, which could eventually lead to a world war. Oh my goodness, more foreign policy. I'm going to talk about Vietnam. Vietnam, I thought that was the 1960s. Well, we need to know the background of Vietnam in the 50s. So in 1954, Vietnamese nationalists, Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was the communist leader of the Vietnam nationalists, and he basically helped start a revolution against France. Okay, for decades they wanted to get rid of the French, and they finally do by 1954. By 1954, the United States was really helping out France by giving them a bunch of money to fight against communist Ho Chi Minh. Communist Ho Chi Minh. All right, so in 1954, the French are losing control of Vietnam, and eventually they are overrun by Ho Chi Minh and the communist forces. And so now there's no more French. Ho Chi Minh and the communists think, oh my goodness, we have our own country now. However, the United States was not going to let that happen. So after the French are gone, Vietnam is divided into two separate countries. And we have the map over here. We have North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Any northern countries, they're always going to be communist. North Korea is communist. North Vietnam is communist. South Vietnam is non-communist. They're not truly democratic because they're led by kind of a dictator named Ngo Dinh Diem, but at least they weren't communist. So I would know by 1954, Vietnam is divided into two countries. They were supposed to have free elections to unite Vietnam into one country, but the non-communists in the United States, we did not want the elections because we were afraid that the Vietnamese would turn to Ho Chi Minh and that Vietnam would become communist. All right, so finally, after the French are gone, the United States is going to provide aid to South Vietnam to fight the communists. During the 1950s, we were providing aid. In 1961, we'll get to this later, JFK is going to send in American military advisors to help the South Vietnamese. And then by 1964, we have the Vietnam War, the escalation of the war by LBJ. LBJ is going to keep sending more and more Americans in. And so by 1968, we have 500,000 Americans fighting in this tiny country called South Vietnam. I will be brief. 1955, the Soviet Union creates the Warsaw Pact to counter American alliance called NATO. Okay, NATO was in the previous chapter. The Warsaw Pact is an agreement between communist countries. An attack against one is an attack against all. Make you be quiet. All right, so in the 50s, overall, remember what's going on in the 50s. You had the Korean War early on, but then throughout the 50s, there's really kind of a thaw. No major events that you need to know about in the 1950s, except for one when we get to Sputnik. We'll get to that later. But overall, tensions are definitely high, and we're afraid we have the arms race. There's no major battles between the U.S. and the Soviets, or really around the world. And so the last thing I'll highlight is the 50s. It was tense, but there was no major events in a push except for Sputnik in 1957. We'll get to that later. But in the 1960s, when JFK begins in 61 and 62, that is the height of the Cold War. We have a couple major events that have to do with Cuba that you may remember. And so JFK really has the hottest part of the Cold War. Of course, that kind of makes sense because some people say, well, that JFK was kind of hot. All right, so our final slide, more foreign policy. So the Cold War is going on, but now we got to start talking about the Middle East because it starts to become really an issue after World War II. All right, first place is in Iran, 1953. The United States government agency called the CIA. We helped create a coup to overthrow the leadership of Iran, and we put in place somebody that we like, and the name known as the Shah Pahlavi. If nothing else, just know that they call him the Shah. Okay, he's called the Shah. He is the ruler of Iran now in 1953, and he is there really to protect our oil. Okay, so we put him in place. We started the revolution. A lot of the Iranians were not too happy with how he treated the people, and so in 1979, Iran had a revolution to overthrow the Shah, and the Shah is overthrown in 1979. Have you ever seen a movie? Ever seen Argo before? And this deals with the big event in APUSH, the Iranian hostage crisis. All this goes back to this event in 1953. All right, Egypt, also important. The name is Nasser. I want you to know this guy's name. Egypt leader is Nasser. And just know out of this line, he is supported by the Soviet Union, and he does not like the United States. So that's a problem not to have an ally in the Middle East. Okay, the Suez Crisis. Okay, the Suez Canal is in Egypt, and Britain, France, and Israel. And this country was formed in 1948 after World War II for many of the Jews that were persecuted during the war. And so Israel and these countries attack Egypt. It's unsuccessful. The United States does not get involved in this crisis. We kind of have a hands-off policy. We don't want to escalate any Cold War tensions. Lastly, 1960, OPEC is formed, okay, and they control much of the world's oil. And OPEC is important because this organization has many problems with the United States, especially in the 1970s, and they actually put in an embargo on oil to the United States in 1973. We'll get to this later, but the OPEC oil embargo is a major event. OPEC was first formed in 1960.